Okay, my name is Dennis Cunningham. I'm a lawyer, and I have worked on the case off and on during the time it's been in existence. Uh, and now I'm going around trying to drum up interest in it while my two partners are back in Chicago trying it day in, day out for the last 15 months.
I'm Don Johnson. I'm a writer and reporter, and at the time Hampton was killed, I was a correspondent in Chicago for Newsweek magazine, and have been following the case ever since.
My name is Ronald Satchen, and I'm a plaintiff in the suit, and I'm a survivor. I was one of the occupants in the apartment at night. I was in the north bedroom, which was adjacent to Fred's room, and I was shot 6 times with machine gun fire. And right now, I'm just going to court trying to find out what's going to come about this suit.
I'm Mike Gray, and I made the film The Murder of Fred Hampton with Howard Alk.
Obviously, being in the room didn't tell you everything that was going on. Of course, a lot was going on behind the scenes, but what was it like in terms of the days leading up? What was the kind of atmosphere back in the days when the Panther Party and the U.S. government were at direct loggerheads, and obviously the FBI and the local police were doing a lot, not only in Chicago, but as we know now, many places around the country, to put down the organization?
Well, at that particular time, as I recall it, there was a lot of harassment that members of the party received in the form of being arrested for selling newspapers, being stopped in automobiles and given tickets and stuff, and been taken to jail. There were a lot of injustices that we, received. And at that time, you have to understand the mood in the black community. And, the relationship that the Black Panther Party had, the animosity between that organization and the police, was only a reflection between, the police and the black community. Because at that time, a lot of people had been gunned down. And it was real tense at this particular time because Fred had his appeal denied, so he knew he was going to go back to jail. And, some people thought that he might not go back to jail, that he might, want to become a fugitive or something.
What about the morning itself? What do you remember of it? Very much?
Well, I
being shot 6 times.
I don't think I ever will forget it, I was in bed asleep, and I recall being awakened by a knock on the door, and it was only a matter of seconds after that when I heard gunfire, and I realized bullets was coming through the room. So after I got up and attempted to put my clothes on, the only thing I could think of doing was getting on the floor, and that's where I was shot, while on the floor.
I was thinking about, I think I was in Chicago right before that. And I know the Chicago police seem to have a very good and specific knowledge of the movement in Chicago. If you walked around the streets with people who were active in the movement, just beat cops would say hello, recognize people by name and say that. It seemed like they knew a lot more than they ought to know if they were just essentially doing their business. What kind of an operation was going on? We got the FBI involved, we got the police involved. How heavily were they into anti-Panther activity and other political organizations? Dave?
Well, it turns out now that they were deeply involved in it, and we didn't really know it at the time. I think we sensed it. I think that, we would talk about it. J. Edgar Hoover said in the middle of '69 that the Black Panther Party was the greatest menace to the internal security of the country, and if we had known then just functionally what we know now about the way they operate, I guess we could have deduced a lot of the stuff they were doing. It turns out that they had a really broad, complicated, widespread, very conscious program of political suppression that they were operating primarily against the Black Panther Party, but also against other groups, SDS notably. I think they were a little less successful in penetrating some other groups than they were with the party. But they also had a lot of more, a better way to move, which was to agitate local police departments against the Panthers. And I think that that's what's being found out, and what will be found out is that where there were confrontations, as there were all over the country, between Panther Party members and local police departments. I mean, they were in Detroit, Colorado, and Des Moines, Iowa, and New Orleans, and L.A., and San Francisco again and again, and in Oakland, and New York, and Brooklyn, and Chicago, and other places, New Haven. And the FBI had a counterintelligence program that reached into all those cities. And I think a total of 22 cities where they had Panther squads that were active on one level or another. And where the documents that have come to light in our trials show that they were actively trying to not just watch them, but to undermine what they were doing, to disrupt their activities, to cause them to get hurt or killed. They fomented the conflicts between the Black Panther Party and the United Slaves Organization in Los Angeles and San Diego, and you can read their memoranda and reports and see them saying we got to capitalize on these differences. We have to do whatever we can to cripple the Black Panthers. Then we refer to shootouts and killings and things like this, and I mean, they would brag about their accomplishments to each other in these memos, and they did in terms of the raid in Chicago. They paid a special bonus to the informant O'Neill of $300, and they had applied for this in terms of, by the time of the raid, just in behalf of the information that had already been provided. And there's a memo coming back from Hoover's office saying, well, in connection with your suggestion that we give O'Neill a bonus, why don't you tell us all about how instrumental he was in the raid where Fred Hampton was killed? And there's a memo back saying, well, they couldn't have done this raid without the information he provided, and it was of great value, saved the lives of police officers in this raid, where, I mean, they're glowing with pride, and he was paid this money. And there are other similarly deep and profound showings in these memoranda of how deeply they were into trying to wipe out the party, trying to do it by any means that they could come across. They sent anonymous letters to people, like the head of there's a big kind of combined street gang organization in the south side of Chicago, the Black Keystone Nation, really a huge federation of former just gangs. And they sent a letter to the leader of that saying that the Panthers had a contract out for him, and that why didn't he do something about it, And then they have to write reports to get permission to do stuff like this, and they say why they think it's going to work, and and they say possibly this will cause the Rangers to take the Keystone Nation to take retaliatory action against the Panther leadership. It's all right out there, and there's enough of it in our case to show that it was going on every place. And there's some stuff that also came out before the Senate committee, the Church Committee, that is clearly establishes that this was going on. Yet the vast bulk of it is still being suppressed, and I mean, the Panthers and their friends from those days have always said there were as many as 25 or 30 people that were murdered, one way or another, because of police and FBI action. And I mean, they've never been taken up on it. There are beginning to be more and more lawsuits of this nature around the country. Not a lot of them are more general. They go on behalf of lots of groups. against all law enforcement that was engaged in that. But it's clear that a major principle of the FBI strategy of disruption of such groups, including the peace movement and the women's movement and now more recently the Puerto Rican independence movement, the American Indian movement, but back then especially against the black movement, was to foment local police departments, and try to provoke confrontations. And this case in Chicago is the one where they were by far the most successful. They went beyond that. I mean, the evidence is clear that it was an outright hit. They broke in the door and made for the bedroom where they knew he'd be sleeping and fired machine gun bullets into his head and killed him before he could wake up.
I just would like to ask what kind of role do you think the film has played as far as providing information that's alternative to what the official reports have been? The film was made several years ago, but do you feel that it's played a role as far as this case is concerned?
The principal effect of the film, when people see the movie, I think that they're moved by being able to see Hampton when he was alive. At the time that he died, he was only 21. So in most of the footage that you see him in the film, he's 20 years old and overpowering. But because of a very unusual set of circumstances, really quite unique, I think, in history, we were able to gain access to a filmed police reenactment of the raid. Now, the reason for that was Hanrahan, the state's attorney, was shocked by the public outcry that greeted Hampton's death. As one person said at the time, they'd been blowing niggers away in Chicago for years and nobody ever said anything. He must have been the most surprised man in all of Chicago that morning when there was a furor, and it was national in scope. What Hanrahan did not realize, and the Chicago establishment, was that Hampton had a broad base of public support, even among people who perhaps didn't agree with his politics specifically, respected the young man, tremendously admired him. There was a great segment of the business community that felt that Hampton was, a really responsible human being. And this public outcry immediately focused upon Hanrahan and the state's attorney's police, and there were cries of murder in public within hours after the raid. And so he responded to that by having the 14 policemen give an exclusive report of the raid to the Chicago Tribune, which published photographs that were provided by the police that circled bullet holes that proved that the Panthers had fired at the police. And then they offered an exclusive reenactment to all 3 Chicago television stations, and they were turned down except WBBM, the local CBS affiliate, went for it. The conditions were unacceptable to NBC and ABC because Hanrahan, the state's attorney, demanded the right to edit the presentation, even though it ran on the news. In other words, it was going to be privately edited film by the state's attorney presented on the news. They did it. And you see this very arch presentation, each officer going through the reenactment one step at a time. And then I stepped over here, I put the machine gun in single fire, and being very careful not to hit the woman on the bed in front of me, I moved the machine gun up. And he's talking about firing through the wall of the apartment. And this version of the raid, which recounts how the Panthers fired at them and they asked 3 times for ceasefire and so forth, we simply took that material and cut it against the footage that we shot in the apartment on that morning, and the effect is overwhelming. You don't really need to know any more than that, because you can see the police saying the straight face, offering their position, and all this. Only in this case, it's totally unique. We had the footage in that apartment from that morning, and the effect is overpowering.
That's
Also,
one of the things I remember about the film is seeing the official propaganda next to the footage that you had, and just the intercutting between the two provides a whole different story from what was broadcast and what was printed up.
One of the things that always impresses me in that film is that conversation of Hanrahan in a press conference trying to defend the photographs that he gave to the Chicago Tribune. And then you see a piece of TV news film, and the announcer points down and he says, "Here we see the nail heads in the door that were supposed to be bullet holes. Here is a tight close-up of nail head and part of the door hasp." And you see all this stuff cut together with the state's attorney's straight-faced statement. It's devastating. And also you see all of the press conference footage of Hanrahan as he is repeatedly backed away from a position. One time, then the next time, and then the next time. He has to keep constant. And finally, at the end, he's totally shattered and looks completely unstrung. But he's still vamping, you know. And it's there is no possibility that you can see the film objectively and not come to the same conclusion that we did when we decided that the only logical name for the movie was The Murder of Fred Hampton. And one of the interesting things that I just found out, that the whole raid may have been over in less than a minute. That in fact they came in, that it didn't last 15 minutes as the police stated in their version, that it lasted a matter of seconds. That they came in through the front door and the back door simultaneously, and with a military precision, with covering fire and all in like in the right directions, knowing exactly from the blueprint which was provided by the FBI informant, who Doc, wasn't he there in the apartment the night before? Didn't he leave earlier?
Yes,
O'Neill?
he did.
What time was he in the apartment? Doc Satchel was in the apartment that night, and the FBI informant who had, unbeknownst to him, given the blueprint of the apartment to the FBI, was there in the apartment. Do you remember anything about that evening?
Well, I wasn't there myself that much, but I do know O'Neill came over there earlier that evening, and he left, and he didn't stay at the apartment all night.
Right. Obviously, he wasn't interested in hanging around for the action, but he certainly provided all the information. And as I understand it, Dennis, there is now some serious corroboration for the allegations that Hampton may have been drugged at the time that he died. Is that true?
That's also true. There has been, just ever since shortly after the killings, there was a chemical test done on his blood by a chemist who was working with a pathologist that had been involved in the case by the family. And there's been this was after a report by the coroner's office found no evidence of alcohol and was silent as to any drugs. And it was apparently just a routine test done. And then this test was done, and it was a positive indication of a presence of secobarbital in a fairly strong dose. And the woman who did that test testified in the trial a few weeks ago, and I think had very convincing evidence that this was that in fact this was true. Now, the FBI, in connection with the grand jury investigation later on in January and February of 1970, obtained an exhumation order out of the federal court in Chicago and did a third autopsy, and claimed at that time to have established that there was no trace of secobarbital in the blood. But this was later pretty thoroughly refuted by a lot of expert testimony to the effect that the blood would have, or that the substance would have deteriorated by that time. And it would have been would also have been neutralized by various embalming processes, things of this nature, so that the test at the later date was not reliable. And so I think largely the her test stands. Dr. Berman's test stands, and the presumption has to be that he did somehow ingest a strong dose of sleeping powder within, late that night. It had to been within a couple of hours at the most of the time he fell asleep, which has been pretty well established. It haven't been maybe 1:30 in the morning, and the corroboration is that two people went from the front room into his bedroom when they first began to break in the door and couldn't wake him. Two
fellow
member
Panthers.
Panthers, yeah, they were asleep in the front room. which was right where the front door was that they came in through. There were altogether 4 people in that room, 3 in the middle bedroom where Doc was, and 2 in the back. And 2 of the 2 guys got up in the front room and ran to the back to waken him and couldn't waken him. And Deborah Johnson, who was in the bed with him, testified that he sort of raised his head and sort of looked like he was trying to wake up and then dropped his head back on the pillow. This was after the bullets had already begun to come into the room, and she said she could feel the mattress jumping with the bullets that were fired in there.
Yeah, see, we're talking about. I think it's important for people to remember it wasn't last year that we're talking about. It was, in 1969, and it was a really difficult time. I was a reporter on the street. It was a very, very political time. What is, I think what we're trying to find out is whether this was a political assassination, one of those that we know occurred overseas, for instance. We're trying to find this out. Nobody can deny that there was a massive cover-up. I mean, I'm really ashamed. It was, fortunately, it was a real sloppy job, but the attempt was really smooth to cover up, beginning from the very first morning, beginning with the very people who were in charge of collecting evidence. They started covering up from the beginning, and it still continues.
I wanted to ask you, as a reporter for Newsweek magazine,
Yes, I was.
how did you get involved in covering the Black Panther Party activities, and then how did that evolve into your present position?
I was simply a member of the Chicago Bureau at the time, and anything that was happening in the 11 states around the Midwest was I could cover, and there was really a lot of media interest in the Black Panthers at the time. Most of it thoroughly wrong, just bad reporting very often. For instance, I remember after one raid in June of 1969, going to the Black Panther headquarters and looking around the headquarters, and I walked upstairs, and there was a storage room, and where breakfast for children had been stored. Well, it was all charred. The police had set fire to it. What they told the press was that they were using a new kind of bullet that, and the press printed it. Nobody really dug anymore. But later on, last year, sitting in court in the courtroom in Chicago, and listening while documents came out talking about just how J. Edgar Hoover personally felt about the Panthers' Breakfast for Children program, and it makes you kind of sick, because I know they burned it.
What is happening in terms of, you've got a suit, which is a civil action, I assume. Not being the state, you can't file criminal charges. Criminal charges were filed at
That's
one
true.
time. And what happened to those, and what, if any, hope is there in people who want to see justice done, that there will be justice done in a criminal sense in any of these associated areas?
Well, there was a criminal case in the Circuit Court of Cook County in 1971 and 72 with a special grand jury, a special prosecutor appointed by the local presiding judge of the criminal court. And it was against Hammerhand and his assistant and the police who were in the raid, and some of the police who were the crime lab technicians that came on, evidence technicians that came on the scene right afterwards, and firearms experts who had faked reports. And it was for obstruction of justice. They were indicted for obstruction of justice in connection with the things they had said and done after the raid to cover up the true nature of what had happened there. And the evidence was the discrepancies between, for example, the bullet holes in the walls and the thing that they had said had been done. And it was really the special prosecutors did what they could in their way, and they were, I think, opposed all the way through in a lot of quiet and noisy ways, and beginning with the very grand jury itself that was selected. But they were also not really... they didn't fight it real hard either, And the trial lasted several months, and at the end of the state's case, the judge threw the whole thing out and acquitted everybody.
Never went to the jury.
And there was no jury. That was one of the things that happened. The defendants liked the judge and hoped to try the case with him, and the special prosecutor agreed to the waiver of the jury and put his case before the judge. And as I say, it was only for obstruction. It only had to do with proving statements and discrepancies and trying to prove some substance of what had happened. And the Panthers all, or many of them, testified in the trial.
So if today Cook County District Attorney wanted to file charges against participants in the raid for conspiracy to commit murder or for murder itself, there wouldn't be anything in the legal system preventing them from doing that.
Probably not. It would certainly be a defense that they would seek to raise, that they had, been acquitted of substantially the same on substantially the same conduct. But I don't think there would be a bar against prosecuting them. There's no statute of limitations on murder.
But the FBI didn't testify.
And the FBI thing was totally unknown during that entire case, so that there's whole other levels of conspiracy that now can be shown, although not necessarily with all the raiders, but certainly with the leaders of the raid.
Well, speaking politically, is there any semblance of reality in that kind of action taking place?
Well, I would say not in the immediate future. I think that I wouldn't want to beg the question what will happen in the long run, because I think we already have been engaged in a long struggle to bring out the truth, and the truth should lead to a settling of accounts with people who have been guilty of this type of thing, if indeed that's what can be shown. And we think it's very clear that it was conscious and deliberate murder, and that it was done for political reasons, and that it was not unique. And but I think that just by virtue of that reality, it's going to wait before there's any accounting until there's enough people who demand one. Justice will not come, the Black Liberation Army says, until the people rise up and see justice done.
This civil suit, what are your expectations? What are you asking for? And what are your expectations in terms of time? 15 months is a long time for a trial. How much longer do you foresee, and what do you hope the outcome will be?
Well, we're suing for a lot of money in actual damages and punitive damages. We're not real optimistic about being able to collect any, and I think no matter what the outcome is, there'll be an appeal by both sides. This could go on for a long time, and the chances of the plaintiffs ever getting any cash money into their hands, even if they do get an award from the jury, are they're problematical, because of all the legal avenues that will remain. Nevertheless, it has to be pursued on that level. It's a jury verdict will be a big decision in terms of the claims and conflicting claims about what happened and what the truth is about what happened. So I don't know. We're just going to push it through. It may go another 2 or 3 months or another 5 or 6 months, depending on how much of a defense is put in, how much evidence the police and the FBI want to put in to try to prove that they didn't do what we said they did. Mainly, their strategy has been during the presentation of the plaintiff's evidence, which is now almost complete, has been to just try to smear the Panthers and make the jury feel that on a gut level, it might have been bad, they might have violated their rights, but it had to be done because these people were so dangerous, the Panthers, and to otherwise just obscure what happened and double talk their way into trying to, hope that the jury will just reject it. The judge seems very much enlisted in this program and has been militant against the admission of difficult evidence, particularly against the FBI. He's just found a million weird excuses. He hasn't scrupled to make the crazy legal rulings to keep things out. He protected the witnesses who were confronted with their own previous statements and with the contents of the documents, which somehow came to light despite his willingness to see them suppressed. And he's just we have long since taken the position about this judge that he's out to beat us, particularly as to the FBI. We had an affidavit from a former member of the United States Attorney's Office who used to represent the FBI agents in the early part of the case, who said that he told him, they'll never prove the FBI killed those fellas, and he's trying to make that come true. So it's been very difficult in court. I mean, it's been, the cover-up just extends and moves into places where it needs to be, because the impulse to cover it up is very strong. I think we feel that the press has played along with this in substantial part, with, again, exceptions, and there have obviously been exceptions in the judges' rulings, and there have to be, because the weight of the truth is so great, and it moves on all fronts. And the cover-up has been massive and sustained, but it can't last forever.